All right, welcome to another lecture, my digital dudes and dudettes. So this lecture will be for April 3rd, which is a Wednesday, and it is entitled Unhealthy Behaviors, as you can see on the slide right in front of you. All right, so let's begin. Now, when we talk about unhealthy behaviors specifically as it relates to athletes, there are a couple disorders that rise to the top, meaning there are a couple disorders or unhealthy behaviors that relate specifically to athletes more so than the general population. And those behaviors, those unhealthy behaviors that we're going to talk about, are listed on this slide here in no particular order, but we've got, and I hope you can see my mouse movements here, we've got eating disorders, substance abuse, addiction to exercise, which might surprise some of you. And then next time, we'll hopefully have time to talk about sexual harassment and compulsive gambling. All right, so first up is eating disorders. And one of the more common or widely known eating disorders out there is anorexia nervosa. And you've probably had some exposure to anorexia at some point in your lives, in your education, maybe in a high school health class or something like that. But anorexia is characterized by a couple key characteristics here. Number one being an intense, irrational fear of gaining weight, of being obese. And hand in hand with this intense irrational fear is a disturbed body image, meaning that the person suffering from anorexia looks in a mirror and sees a very different image than what exists in reality. Uh, so that's sort of the mental side of anorexia. There's this intense, irrational, dramatic, overwhelming fear of gaining weight, being obese, being overweight, and coupled with that is this hallucination that their body image, their physical body, is different than how it is in real life. So then on the physical side of things, you usually see an extreme amount of weight loss, which is characterized by the images on the right side of the screen. This would be someone suffering from that dramatic weight loss. And then amenorrhea, which would be an absence of your period if you're a woman. Now, anorexia there's a couple distinguishing characteristics that need to be met to get this clinical diagnosis of anorexia. One being that your body weight needs to be 15% below what's considered normal for your age, your sex, and your height. So that's sort of the criteria. If you're at 14%, well, sorry, you may need help, but you don't quite get that clinical diagnosis. That's one of the bigger problems with the DSM, which is the big Bible for psychiatric and psychological disorders, but that's not a discussion we're having in this lecture. Unfortunately, anorexia is a very deadly disorder. It has one of the highest mortality rates of any disorder listed in the DSM, and that's hovering around a 5% mortality rate. About 15% of people who are diagnosed with anorexia do go on to commit suicide. So this is a very serious issue. It is a very deadly disorder, um, and it's also characterized and compounded and just made much more difficult by the fact that people who suffer from this disorder oftentimes are unaware that they are abnormally skinny. They're unaware that they are as skinny as this woman looks on the right-hand side of your screen. And again, that goes back to that disturbed body image. So they don't think there's anything wrong. It's very difficult to help someone with a disorder if they don't see what they're suffering from as a disorder. So then the next eating disorder we're going to talk about is bulimia nervosa. And this can be just as serious as anorexia, but oftentimes it's sort of a precursor to anorexia. So bulimia is distinguished by very episodic, patterns of binging and purging. Binging being a large consumption of calories, so huge food intake cycles or periods, followed by purging cycles. And a purging cycle might take several different forms. It could be someone going for extreme amounts of exercise, they could be fasting, they could uh, vomit, make themselves vomit of all the food they just ate, or they could take large amounts of laxatives, which would force it to come out the other end. And during these binging cycles, when the food consumption is happening, there's often reported a lack of control. The person who's experiencing that binging period can't stop themselves from consuming all that food. So those are the physical symptoms that occur with bulimia nervosa. Then on the mental side of things, we've got a depressed mood and a negative thought cycle, which that negative thought cycle is sort of difficult to get out of, and those depressed thoughts that come hand in hand with that negative thought cycle, that's oftentimes what leads to the start of these binging and purging cycles. Now, bulimia and anorexia are different disorders, but they have a high level of comorbidity. Specifically, bulimia can lead to anorexia. It doesn't necessarily have to. It doesn't in every single case, but it can. In bulimia, the picture is slightly rosier than anorexia. Um, Usually, patients who suffer from bulimia are aware of their problems. They're aware of the disorder that they're suffering from. And anytime your patient is aware of the symptoms, they're aware of the abnormality that they're under, you usually have a lot more success with treatment. Bulimia is a very, very common disorder, unfortunately. Across the lifespan, about 1% of the general population has a chance of suffering from bulimia. So then a very recent development in the DSM is the new addition of a disorder called bigorexia, which is similar but very different to anorexia. So anorexia, the person is very concerned with gaining weight. Their views of their body are distorted to make themselves look fatter. In bigorexia, the condition is the exact opposite. So someone is very toned, very large, very muscled, like this little cartoon character on the right-hand side of your screen, but their perceptions distort reality so that they feel like they look like this image in the mirror here. Very skinny, scrawny, lacking the muscles that they have in reality. This is a form of body dysmorphia, which is just sort of a general clinical term for distorted body image. So someone suffering from body dysmorphia sees themselves very different from how they actually are in reality. So there is some controversy around bigorexia as to whether or not it exists. It's sort of a subset of this larger umbrella term, body dysmorphia. But if you guys are looking for a little bit of fun, a sort of lighthearted approach to this idea of bigorexia, I'd encourage you to click this link here. That'll take you to a pretty short YouTube video of a couple Norwegian bodybuilders who go to this little village town in Norway, and they have a little bit of fun with how big they are in this silly little town that they're visiting. Oh, you're really big. Anyway, now, when it comes to eating disorders in athletes, it's a particularly tricky problem to study for a number of reasons. So, eating disorders are very, very difficult to accurately track in athletes. Number one, because this is very personal information. If someone is aware that they're suffering from an eating disorder, it's not often something that you want to be open and honest about. It's very personal. It could be humiliating. They could be just really uncomfortable talking about these things, even with a coach, even with a clinical professional or something like that. So for that reason, we don't have a lot of good data on eating disorders in athletes. Another big reason that athletes may not be very forthcoming with this kind of personal information is that if it is known that they are suffering from an eating disorder or any mental disorder for that matter, there is a very real chance they could be kicked off the team. They could lose their position. They could be forced into some sort of treatment program before they're reinstated on the team or something like that. So this can be a really difficult area to navigate, particularly with athletes, because there's so much on the line. There's a lot at stake. So, like I said, we don't have very good data, and I have seen studies that put the prevalency of eating disorders in athletes in a huge range. I've seen studies as low as 1% of athletes suffering from eating disorders, and I've seen studies as high as 60% showing that athletes suffer from eating disorders. So that's a huge range. On one hand, you're saying over half of all athletes have some form of eating disorder, and then on the other hand, you're saying 1% of athletes have eating disorders. So that's a huge range there, and basically that means we can't really trust our numbers. Again, it's a very difficult, very personal issue. A lot of athletes are probably not very forthcoming as far as this information. But it has been documented in virtually every sport. Gymnasts, archers have also been shown to suffer from eating disorders. And this does occur in athletes at a higher rate than the general public. That much we do know. There's a huge range of estimates for where that number falls, but in most studies, that estimate is higher than what it is in the general population. So athletes seem to be at a higher risk for eating disorders than the general public. And this could be for a couple reasons. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure in the lives of athletes to perform. A lot of those performance issues could relate back to body image issues. There's an enormous amount of social pressure from coaches, from teammates, to be in shape, to perform during game time situations. And some sports have very strict weight restrictions. I'm thinking specifically of wrestling here, but there's also some other sports. Boxing comes to mind. And if you don't meet those weight restrictions, well, you may have to face a different opponent in a different weight class. And then lastly, socio-cultural factors, and I'm thinking specifically here of social physique anxiety. So there are lots of sports out there that require athletes to wear somewhat minimal clothing. And oftentimes you're wearing that minimal clothing in front of a large audience. That would cause pretty much anyone a little bit of anxiety. Some sports require less clothing than others, like swimsuits for swimmers might be very revealing, and that can lead to a lot of anxiety about the way that your body looks, and that can be just fuel for a fire when it comes to an eating disorder. So for these reasons, athletes might be at a very much higher risk for eating disorders than the general public. So to finish up the eating disorder discussion here, there are some signs, both physical and psychological, that someone might be suffering from an eating disorder, and those are listed on the slide in front of you. On the physical side of things, there might be a large amount of weight loss, a large amount of weight gain. So it's not so much the loss or the gain, it's just the dramatic change. Swollen salivary glands, amenorrhea, again, that's that lack of menstruation. Sores and calluses on the back of one's hand. This could be an indication that they're sticking their fingers down their throat in order to make themselves vomit. This could come about by having the back of their hand scrape on their teeth as they're removing their hand from their mouth. Stomach complaints might also be possibly related to causing yourself to vomit so much. On the psychological side of things, excessive dieting, excessive exercise. That excessive exercise could be that purging part of the binging and purging cycle in bulimia. A lot of guilt related to food behaviors. If someone, eats a couple too many slices of pizza and they're talking about it a lot, how they're going to get fat, how they seem just so guilty about it. They might actually be in a bad mood because they um, just went ahead and ate those 3 slices of pizza or something like that. Avoidance of eating in public, frequent weighing, and then again, body image. If someone seems to be very, very concerned with how their body looks, that's not necessarily a red flag for an eating disorder, but it is something that you might want to check up on if it's a close friend or something like that. All right, so that's all I want to say about eating disorders, and then I want to move on to substance abuse. So I want to start this topic by showing you a couple results from 2 questions that Olympic athletes were given in 1995 through a little survey here. So question number 1, you are offered a banned performance enhancing substance with 2 guarantees. Number 1, you will not be caught, and number 2, you will win. Would you take the substance? So, kind of a loaded question there. Would you take the substance? Well, geez, I don't know. I'm not going to be caught. I will win. What's the downside? Well, you're kind of cheating. Kind of definitely cheating. That is the definition of cheating right there. A performance enhancing substance that is banned. Okay, and then the second question. You are offered a banned performance enhancing substance with 2 guarantees. Number 1, you will not be caught. And number 2, you will win every competition you enter for the next 5 years and then die from the side effects of the substance. Would you take the substance? Oh wow, okay, so the situation is a hell of a lot different here in the second question. You're still going to win, you're still not going to be caught, but you're going to die from taking this substance. So, let's see what the results were. This question was asked to 195 different Olympic athletes. In the first question, 95% of the Olympic athletes asked said they would take the substance. They would take that banned performance enhancing substance, they would not be caught, and they would win. 95% of the people said that they would do that. Now, this question here sparks a debate about doping and anti-doping procedures and how to catch cheaters and all that. But it's much more interesting to look at the responses to the second question, where they'll take the drug, they'll win, they won't be caught, but then they'll die after 5 years. 60% of the respondents still said they would take the substance. 60% of people said it's worth it to win every competition, keep your honor, I guess, your character intact by not being caught, and then just die after 5 years of success, 5 years of winning every competition, you die. That is very troubling. The first, you could make some arguments that that's an extreme form of competitiveness, trying to find any edge that your competitor doesn't have. But the second question, this is a lot more cut and dry. Anyone who said yes to this question, that's that's troubling. That's a big red flag that you're willing to die for a win that you cheated on. Now, let's talk about substance abuse. So, substance abuse is a maladaptive pattern of psychoactive substance use. Now, maladaptive means that it is self-harming. You are injuring yourself physically by taking this substance. You are injuring yourself mentally by taking this substance. You may be harming the social relationships in your life. You may be harming your career chances. You may be harming your school performance. But that's what that term maladaptive means. In some way, your life is being negatively affected by taking this substance. So you continue to take this substance despite obvious knowledge that it is negatively affecting your social, occupational, psychological, or physical health. And it's important to note here this capitalized word here in the middle of the slide, prolonged. So substance abuse can occur for short periods of time, and yes, that is troubling, but it is prolonged substance abuse that we are much more concerned about. So this type of behavior that continues for weeks, for months, even years, That is what we're mostly concerned with here. So if you happen to go through, I don't know, a bad breakup or a divorce, or maybe you lost your job or something, I wouldn't say it's normal and healthy to go through a short period of substance abuse, but it's not necessarily troubling. If it's prolonged, that's where it becomes troubling. So that's substance abuse, which is different from drug addiction. So drug addiction is a state in which if you stopped using that substance, if you stopped using that drug, this would create an overwhelming desire, an overwhelming need, an overwhelming craving for that substance. And when we talk about drug addiction, we usually talk about it in two different ways. There's the physical side of addiction and the mental side of addiction. So physical addiction is simply your body craving that substance that it has just gotten used to. So if you smoke cigarettes, or if you chew tobacco, if you um, regularly ingest nicotine in some way, and then you all of a sudden stop smoking, stop chewing, you stop giving your body regular doses of nicotine, there will be a period of time where your body is craving that nicotine. You might be a little grumpy, you might have some headaches, you might have, your body will respond by freaking out a little bit. There used to be this substance here that made it feel good, and then all of a sudden it's not there. Physical addiction is relatively easy to get over. It's something that our bodies can bounce back from, honestly, in a matter of weeks. It's the mental addiction side of things that is much more dangerous and much more difficult to get rid of. It's those mental desires, it's those cognitive needs, it's the feeling that we need this substance. That is much, much harder to get rid of. And that is not nearly as cut and dry. So we've got our two terms here: substance abuse, drug addiction, two very different, but a little forward there. Let's go back. Okay, hopefully that didn't screw up the narration too much. All right, so then steroids are the next big substance that I want to talk about. And steroid use is very interesting. Uh, at least I find it interesting, kind of in a morbid way. In 2003, the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, found, again, based on what numbers they had available, that 1 in every 16 high school athletes will have at least experimented with steroid use. That's 1 in every 16 high school athletes experimenting with steroid use. That seems a little bonkers, but it gets even crazier if you look at middle schoolers. Uh, Young girls in middle school have been found to be using steroids, not necessarily to improve their athletic performance, but because of the, I guess, positive benefits it has for bodily physique. One study that the CDC cites states that 7% of middle school girls have used or experimented with steroids uh, for bodily physique reasons. 7%. That is just an incredibly depressing number uh, for me. And this is something that all athletes will probably struggle with at some level, to some extent. There are some pretty strong arguments to make on either side of this. Should you take steroids? Should you not? There are some definite benefits. There are some very big risks. And a great example, a great case study would be Lance Armstrong. The man became filthy rich, absolutely filthy, stinking rich, abusing and cheating in bike races. And he eventually did get caught. He suffered, huge, like basically a PR nightmare that he brought on himself. But he's still pretty darn rich. He was fined a lot, but he still has a lot of money left over. Um, kind of seems like he won in that situation. All right, so here we go. Here's the next slide now. Believe it or not, there are, I wouldn't call it a growing group of people, but there is a movement out there that people are saying that it would be a good thing if steroid use was legalized. in an athletic environment. And some of the arguments they make are listed on this slide here. Number one, there would be a higher level of performance, and this would lead to an increase in interest from spectators. People would pay more money to see these sporting events between people who are kind of, jacked up on steroids to a higher level of performance. So it would generate more income, it would generate more interest in the sport. It would actually be easier to regulate if it was legalized. That is an argument that you hear quite a bit about marijuana these days. If you legalize it, it's just easier to control. And then lastly, there, athletes oftentimes are already accepting certain risks. They are accepting risks to their body by engaging in sports. And so, taking a substance that enhances your performance and may have some negative health side effects, well, that's one more risk that some athletes might be willing to take. Um, and then finally, a lot of people who argue for this say, what is a clean athlete anyway? And this might be kind of a weird argument to make, but it might make sense if you think of it in terms of, well, something that I'm familiar with would be the long distance running scene. So nowadays, there's a huge debate raging in the running community about what constitutes cheating when it comes to shoes. There are some new shoes out there that you can buy for way too much money, if you ask me, that have been shown to decrease your marathon times, that essentially make you run faster by as much as 5%. If you can shave 5% off your own personal record, your own personal best, that's definitely going to be something that people are interested in. And a lot of people are starting to set records, run very, very fast races in, um, uh, what is it, the Nike Vaporfly? I think that's what it's called. And so this brings up a whole argument of, okay, well, at what point does a shoe give you an unfair advantage? Do all shoes give you an unfair advantage? What is a clean athlete when it comes to shoes and long distance running? And there's purists on one side of the spectrum who would say that all shoes are an unfair advantage. People should be running marathons barefoot. Believe it or not, there are large numbers of people that run marathons barefoot. Back in the, what was that? I want to say it was 72 or 74. There was a very famous Ethiopian runner who won the gold medal in the Olympic marathon running barefoot. And then the very next Olympics, he ran faster in a pair of shoes and still won gold. But anyway, so that is a debate that a lot of people supporting this idea of legalizing steroid use. All right, and then the last disorder related to athletes that I want to talk about is addiction to exercise. Now, addiction to exercise is it's a very imposing sounding term. It's got addiction in it. And it certainly can be a bad thing. When it's a bad thing, we call it a negative addiction. So a negative addiction to exercise is characterized by a dependence. There are quite literally withdrawal symptoms if someone is not able to exercise. And they are exercising so much that it is negatively affecting other parts of their life. So again, they're losing friends because they're not spending time with them, because they're exercising all the time. They might be getting fired. They maybe can't hold down a job because they're putting so much time and energy into exercising. They show up to work tired. They show up to work late, maybe something like that. Obviously, that's a negative side to addiction to exercise. The positive side to an addiction to exercise, this would just be someone who really, 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 really enjoys exercising. You do, make time for it. You make an appropriate amount of time for it. You still have healthy social relationships. You still have healthy personal relationships, but you're still fitting in the time to exercise. Um, Now, this kind of terminology is just something that's often used in addiction literature, especially in treatment programs. There's primary dependence and secondary dependence. So primary dependence would be exercise is the goal of addiction behavior. So your main addiction is to actual exercise behavior. Secondary dependence would be this addiction to exercise is a symptom of a greater, more threatening underlying condition. So the example given there on the slide is an eating disorder. Someone who's suffering from an eating disorder may exhibit symptoms of addiction to exercise, but if you truly want to help that person, you will treat the eating disorder, not the addiction to exercise disorder. Some of the symptoms that exist of a negative addiction, um, there's an increasing need for larger and larger amounts of exercise. Um, those withdrawal symptoms would be anxiety or anger without exercise. Oftentimes they'll sort of lose track of time and they'll spend more time than they were planning to in the gym or in the fitness center. There's this sense of a loss of control. Once they start working out, they just can't stop, or they feel like they don't have control over their behavior. They don't have a choice; they have to work out. Time is the big thing here. If someone is spending, 2, 3, 4 hours every single day, 7 days a week, in the gym, that's maybe where it starts to look like an addiction. And then largely on the right side of your screen here, the behavior continues despite these obvious problems, despite the fact that someone's life is being negatively affected by their exercise addiction. They continue to engage in exercise behavior. So how do we prevent this? Um, Again, data is not very good on how prevalent this is because it's a very personal issue. There are some pretty big drawbacks to being honest. You could be kicked off a team, could lose your position, things like that. So we don't have very good numbers on how prevalent it is, but we do have some good information on how to prevent it. Number one, schedule rest days. Rest days are arguably just as important as your workout days. That's especially true in long distance running training. You want to religiously protect your rest days. Work out regularly with a slower partner, or maybe someone who doesn't spend as much time in the weight room as you, or maybe doesn't run as fast as you. You know, have a day, maybe 2 days every week, where you work out with that person and maybe you help them, you spot them in the weight room, or you run at their level, just to sort of make sure you're not over exercising yourself. If you do become injured, for the love of God, please stop. Um, Make sure you're taking ample time to recover from that injury. And this can be one of the most frustrating, most stressful parts of any athlete's life, but it's incredibly important to do so. Make sure you have hard training days and easy training days. Set realistic goals. Don't stress yourself out by setting unrealistic goals. And then lastly, I've got this over here, drop the F-bomb. So the F-bomb means fun. That's what the F stands for. Make sure your workouts, make sure your training sessions are fun. Make sure you're leaving the gym or you're ending your runs in a good mood. If you're consistently being more anxious, if you're consistently angry at the end of a workout session, maybe because you didn't run as fast as you wanted to, or you didn't lift as much as you wanted to, that's a bad sign. If working out is putting you in a bad mood, that's a pretty big red flag right there. So make sure that you're actually enjoying your workout sessions. Make sure you're dropping lots of F-bombs. Okay, so that's all I've got for lecture-wise. Now, there is another worksheet that accompanies this lecture, and it should be located in the same place you found this lecture, under the resources option on the course website in the recorded lectures group. And so this is a checklist, and this is for yourself. Um, you go run through the checklist, and this will kind of hopefully bring anything to your own attention if you are suffering from or at risk from suffering from an unhealthy exercise addiction. If you are, maybe this is a good uh, catalyst for you to go explore this a little bit further, possibly seek out some remedies. I would also encourage you to kind of look out for your friends, look out for your teammates if you think this might apply to them. But anyway, I'd encourage you to do that. Um, I want to say I'll collect this worksheet, but due to the fact that it contains some potentially personal information, I think I will not collect it. Um, but yeah, let's say it's extra credit. So if you want to turn it in, I'll give you some extra credit for it. If you don't want to turn it in, then don't. Uh, but since you turn it in, I will see it. I don't want you to feel like you have to turn it in if it does contain personal information that you don't want to share. So if you want the extra credit for doing it, but you don't want me to see personal information, then go ahead and just fill one out as fake, I guess. And that's kind of how we'll do that. So extra credit opportunity there. Fill out this worksheet, hand it to me. If you don't want to share personal information with me, which I totally understand, then go ahead and fill out a fake one. Okay, that's the lecture. See you later, digital dudes and dudettes.